August 9th, 378 AD. The sun rose over the Thracian plains near Adrianople, illuminating what would become one of history's most catastrophic battlefields. Emperor Valens, ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, stood among his legions watching Gothic cavalry scouts disappear into the heat shimmer on the horizon. The 58-year-old emperor had marched his army 12 miles from Adrianople in summer heat, denied his men water and rest, all to catch an enemy he believed was vulnerable and desperate. What Valens didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he surveyed the Gothic wagon circle in the distance, was that he was about to preside over a massacre that would fundamentally alter the course of Western civilization. The Gothic cavalry, the force that would decide the battle, wasn't where Roman scouts had reported them. They were coming. And when they arrived, they would demonstrate a form of warfare that made Rome's legendary infantry irrelevant. This is the story of how an empire that had dominated the Mediterranean for 800 years discovered that the world had changed, that heavy cavalry had rendered the Roman legion obsolete, and that military supremacy built over centuries could evaporate in a single afternoon. The crisis that led to Adrianople began 2 years earlier in 376 AD, when the Goths appeared on the north bank of the Danube River, not as invaders, but as refugees. Behind them, the Huns, nomadic warriors from the Asian steppes, had swept westward, destroying everything in their path. The Gothic Confederation, composed of Tervingi and Gruthungi tribes, faced annihilation. Their leaders sent envoys to Emperor Valens with a desperate proposal: allow us to cross the Danube into Roman territory. We will settle on empty lands, provide soldiers for your armies, and become loyal subjects of Rome. To Roman officials, this seemed like an opportunity. The empire was chronically short of military manpower. Germanic warriors had served in Roman armies for generations. Here was a chance to gain thousands of potential recruits, while simultaneously creating a buffer zone against the Huns. Valens approved the migration. What followed was a case study in administrative corruption and incompetence that transformed potential allies into mortal enemies. Roman officials assigned to manage the Gothic settlements saw not desperate refugees but profit opportunities. The Goths were starving when they crossed the Danube, their supplies exhausted by the flight from the Huns. Roman commanders, led by the provincial governor Lupicinus, hoarded relief supplies meant for Gothic families and sold food at inflated prices, sometimes demanding Gothic children as slaves in exchange for bread. The ancient historian Ammianus Marcellinus, a former Roman soldier who witnessed the aftermath, recorded that Roman officials traded dog meat at the rate of 1 dog for 1 Gothic slave child. Gothic warriors watched their families starve while Roman granaries remained full just miles away. The Gothic leader Fritigern, a capable commander who had initially advocated cooperation with Rome, found his position increasingly untenable. His people were dying, Roman promises were hollow, and his warriors demanded action. In 377 AD, the inevitable explosion occurred. At a banquet in Marcianople, Lupicinus attempted to assassinate Fritigern and other Gothic leaders, apparently believing he could solve the Gothic problem by eliminating their leadership. The plot failed. Fritigern escaped, and his enraged warriors fell upon the nearest Roman forces. The Gothic War had begun. What made this conflict different from previous barbarian incursions was the nature of the Gothic forces. These weren't raiding parties or small warbands. This was an entire people, complete with families, wagons, livestock, and most critically, a corps of professional heavy cavalry that had been forged in generations of warfare on the Eurasian steppes. Gothic noble warriors fought as cataphracts, heavily armoured cavalry using long lances and swords. Unlike Roman cavalry, which served primarily as scouts and skirmishers, Gothic heavy cavalry was designed to deliver devastating shock charges that could shatter infantry formations. The stirrup had not yet been invented, but Gothic horsemen used special saddles with high cantles and pommels that allowed them to brace themselves and deliver powerful lance strikes without being unhorsed. Throughout 377 and early 378, Gothic forces ravaged Thrace, modern-day Bulgaria and northeastern Greece, burning cities and defeating every Roman force sent against them. Valens, who had been campaigning in the east against Persia, hurried westward with his field army. He established his base at Constantinople and began methodically gathering forces for a decisive campaign. By summer 378, Valens had assembled approximately 20,000 troops, a substantial field army by late Roman standards, his force included the classic components of Roman military power: the heavy infantry, legionaries equipped with spear, sword, and large shields formed the backbone. They were supported by auxiliary infantry, archers, and approximately 2,000 cavalry. These were the descendants of the legions that had conquered the Mediterranean, professional soldiers with excellent equipment and traditional Roman discipline. The emperor had a strategic problem. His nephew Gratian, emperor of the Western Roman Empire, was marching eastward with reinforcements. Multiple advisors urged Valens to wait for Gratian's arrival, which would give Rome overwhelming numerical superiority. But Valens faced political pressures that made waiting difficult. Gratian, though his nephew, was also a rival. If Gratian arrived and the combined imperial forces crushed the Goths, Gratian would claim much of the credit. Valens, who had endured mockery for his earlier military setbacks, wanted a victory he could claim as his own. Roman scouts reported that the main Gothic force under Fritigern numbered only about 10,000 warriors and was camped near Adrianople. The Goths appeared vulnerable, their cavalry away on a foraging expedition. To the emperor and his advisors, this looked like an opportunity too good to miss. Strike now, destroy the Gothic infantry before their cavalry returned, and end the war in a single decisive battle. It was a fatal miscalculation based on intelligence that was both incomplete and outdated. On August 9th, Valens marched his army from Adrianople at dawn. The day was already hot, temperatures climbing toward what contemporary sources describe as oppressive heat. The 12-mile march to the Gothic position was conducted in full armour, under the blazing Mediterranean sun without adequate water supplies. Valens had prioritised speed over logistics, wanting to reach the Goths before they could relocate. Roman soldiers, burdened with equipment weighing 60 to 80 pounds, struggled through the heat. Casualties from heat exhaustion began before any enemy was sighted. Men collapsed along the march route. Officers pushed the columns forward, driven by the emperor's urgency. By early afternoon, the Roman army reached the Gothic position. What they found confirmed their intelligence reports and reinforced their confidence. The Goths had formed a defensive circle of wagons on elevated ground, a standard defensive formation for a mobile people protecting their families and possessions. Women and children were visible within the wagon circle. Gothic infantry, estimated at 8,000 to 10,000 warriors, stood in defensive positions. There was no sign of the Gothic heavy cavalry. The absence of enemy cavalry should have concerned Roman commanders. Where was the Gothic mounted force? Were they truly away foraging, or was this a trap? These questions apparently went unasked or unanswered. The Romans deployed for battle in traditional formation. Heavy infantry formed the centre in dense blocks. Light infantry and archers positioned on the flanks. The cavalry, outnumbered and outclassed by their Gothic counterparts even when present, deployed on the wings but without enthusiasm or confidence. Fritigern, watching from the Gothic position, immediately recognised the danger his people faced. His infantry was outnumbered, and his cavalry, under commanders Alathius and Saphrax, was indeed away from the main camp. But Fritigern was a skilled tactician who understood both Roman impatience and the value of time. He sent urgent messengers galloping toward the Gothic cavalry with orders to return immediately. Then he initiated diplomatic negotiations. Gothic envoys approached the Roman lines under a flag of truce, requesting a parley. Fritigern offered to discuss terms, suggested exchanging hostages, proposed various settlements. It was all theatre designed to delay the Roman attack. Each hour of negotiation was another hour for the Gothic cavalry to return. Valens, exhausted from the march and eager for battle, entertained these negotiations briefly, but suspicion grew among his officers. Some recognised the delaying tactic for what it was. Others argued for immediate attack before the Gothic cavalry could arrive. The emperor wavered, negotiations continued, and precious time slipped away. While diplomatic discussions proceeded, the Roman army stood in full battle formation under the afternoon sun. Soldiers who had marched 12 miles without adequate water now waited in armour, shields raised, as temperatures peaked. Heat exhaustion claimed more victims. Men fainted in formation. Water supplies were exhausted. The simple act of standing in armour under the August sun was sapping Roman strength minute by minute. Around 2 p.m, the negotiations collapsed. Whether Valens lost patience or his officers convinced him that delay favoured the enemy, the emperor ordered the attack. The Roman infantry began advancing up the gentle slope toward the Gothic wagon circle. Heavy infantry in the centre, light troops on the flanks, the classic Roman assault formation that had won 1,000 battles. The Goths initially gave ground. Gothic infantry fell back toward their wagon circle, maintaining defensive cohesion but not offering determined resistance. To Roman commanders, this must have seemed like confirmation of victory. The enemy was retreating. One good push would break them. Then the sound changed. Soldiers in the Roman ranks heard it first, a deep rumbling that grew louder, the thunder of thousands of hooves pounding the Thracian plain. The Gothic cavalry had returned. Alathius and Saphrax arrived with approximately 4,000 to 5,000 heavy cavalry, the finest mounted warriors of the Gothic Confederation. They had ridden hard in response to Fritigern's urgent summons, and they arrived at the perfect moment, with the Roman infantry committed to the attack and vulnerable. The Gothic cavalry didn't engage in skirmishing or manoeuvring. They immediately formed for a mass charge and launched themselves at the Roman flanks. This was shock cavalry warfare executed with devastating precision. Thousands of armoured horsemen bearing lances and swords, riding in tight formation at full gallop, smashed into the sides of the Roman army. The impact was catastrophic. Roman cavalry on the flanks, already demoralised and outnumbered, broke immediately. Most fled without offering serious resistance. Some cavalry units simply dissolved, individual riders spurring their horses away from the Gothic onslaught. The Roman flanks collapsed in minutes. With their cavalry screen destroyed, Roman infantry found themselves attacked from 3 directions. Gothic infantry pressed from the front, while Gothic cavalry wheeled and charged repeatedly into the Roman flanks and rear. The Roman formation, designed for frontal combat, had no answer to attacks from multiple directions. Roman infantry attempted to form defensive squares, a standard response to cavalry attack. But they were too densely packed, the formations too rigid. Men couldn't manoeuvre in the crush. The outer ranks, trying to face outward against cavalry charges, pressed against comrades behind them. The entire army began compressing into a tighter and tighter mass. Ammianus Marcellinus, our primary source for the battle, described soldiers packed so tightly they couldn't raise their arms to use weapons. Men were trampled by their own comrades. The wounded couldn't fall down but remained upright, held in place by the press of bodies. The Gothic cavalry charged again and again. Each charge drove deeper into the Roman formation. Lances pierced through shield and armour. Swords rose and fell. Roman soldiers tried to fight back, but they were fighting blind, unable to see attackers coming from the flanks and rear, unable to manoeuvre in the crush of their own formation. The afternoon heat that had exhausted the Romans during the march now became a weapon. Men collapsing from heat exhaustion couldn't be evacuated. The dying couldn't be moved. The press of bodies generated its own heat. Soldiers in full armour, already dehydrated, began dropping from heat stroke, even without being struck by enemy weapons. For Roman officers trying to maintain control, the situation was impossible. Commands couldn't be heard over the noise of battle. Units couldn't see each other through the dust and press of bodies. The tight formations that were the foundation of Roman tactical doctrine had become death traps. Emperor Valens, positioned with the reserve units, could see his army disintegrating. Some sources suggest he tried to rally units, attempting to restore cohesion through personal example. Other accounts have him attempting to extract himself and his guard from the collapsing formation. Either way, the emperor's fate was sealed by the same crushing defeat that doomed his army. The Gothic cavalry continued their systematic destruction of the Roman force. What had been a battle became a slaughter. Roman soldiers trapped in the press couldn't retreat, couldn't advance, could only die where they stood. Those who attempted to flee were run down by Gothic cavalry. Small groups that broke free and tried to form defensive positions were surrounded and destroyed. As afternoon turned to evening, the killing continued. Roman units ceased to exist as organised formations. It became a massacre of individuals and small groups. Gothic warriors moved through the wreckage, killing the wounded, stripping bodies, hunting for valuables. The Roman army, one of the largest field forces the Eastern Empire could assemble, had been annihilated. The casualty figures were appalling even by ancient warfare standards. Ammianus Marcellinus estimates that 2/3 of the Roman army was destroyed. Modern historians generally accept that 12,000 to 15,000 Roman soldiers died at Adrianople. Perhaps 3/4 of the force Valens had led into battle. Among the dead were 35 senior officers, including tribunes and generals who commanded major formations. 2/3 of the Roman officer corps was wiped out in a single afternoon. Emperor Valens himself died in the battle, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. Some accounts have him killed fighting among his guards. Others suggest he was wounded and taken to a farmhouse that was then burned by Goths, unaware of the valuable prisoner inside. His body was never recovered or identified. The Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire simply disappeared into the slaughter. The survivors, perhaps 5,000 men, fled under cover of darkness. Many died in the flight, pursued by Gothic cavalry, or succumbing to wounds and exhaustion. Some made it to Adrianople, others scattered across Thrace. Entire legions had ceased to exist. The Lanciari and Mattiari, elite Palatine legions, were destroyed completely. The Scutari and Armaturae suffered such losses that they were never reconstituted. The Gothic losses were comparatively light. Modern estimates suggest perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 Gothic warriors were killed or wounded, most during the initial Roman advance before the cavalry arrived. It was one of the most one-sided major battles in Roman history. News of the disaster reached Constantinople within days. The city erupted in panic. Citizens expected Gothic armies to appear at any moment. The walls were manned by whoever could bear arms. The new emperor Gratian, who received word while still marching eastward, reportedly wept when told of his uncle's death and the scale of the defeat. The immediate military consequences were severe. The Eastern Roman Empire had lost its field army. There was no comparable force available to replace it. The Goths, emboldened by victory, ranged freely across the Balkans. Cities that had stood for centuries were sacked. The province of Thrace, once a wealthy agricultural region, was devastated. But the long-term consequences were even more profound. Adrianople shattered the myth of Roman military invincibility. For centuries, Rome's enemies had believed that while individual battles might be won, Rome always prevailed in the end. The legions were considered ultimately unbeatable. Adrianople destroyed that assumption. If the emperor himself could be killed and his entire army annihilated, Rome was vulnerable. The battle also demonstrated the obsolescence of traditional Roman infantry tactics. The legion, with its heavy infantry and rigid formations, couldn't cope with mobile heavy cavalry. The Gothic victory wasn't a fluke or the result of Roman mistakes, though there were plenty of those. It was a demonstration that military technology and tactics had evolved beyond Rome's capacity to adapt. The next century of Roman history was dominated by this reality. The empire increasingly relied on barbarian federates for military strength, because Roman recruitment and training systems couldn't produce the cavalry forces needed to contest control of the battlefield. The very people Rome fought at Adrianople would soon form the core of Roman armies. The political consequences rippled for decades. The Gothic Confederation, unable to be defeated militarily, had to be accommodated diplomatically. In 382 AD, Emperor Theodosius settled the Goths as federates within the empire, granting them land and autonomy in exchange for military service. It was an acknowledgement that Rome couldn't expel them by force. This settlement created a precedent. Other barbarian groups saw that Rome could be defeated, that military pressure could force favourable terms. The trickle of Germanic migration into the empire became a flood. Roman provinces filled with peoples who owed no real loyalty to Rome, maintained their own leadership and military forces, and existed as autonomous entities within imperial borders. Within a generation, a Gothic leader named Alaric, who may have been present at Adrianople as a young warrior, would lead an army to sack Rome itself in 410 AD, the first time the Eternal City had fallen to foreign enemies in 800 years. The direct line from Adrianople to the eventual collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD is clear. But perhaps the most significant lesson of Adrianople was tactical. The battle marked a fundamental shift in how warfare would be conducted for the next 1,000 years. Heavy cavalry, not infantry, would dominate European battlefields throughout the medieval period. The mounted knight would become the decisive military force. The infantry-based legions that conquered the Mediterranean world were an evolutionary dead end. At the Royal Armouries in Leeds, England, there's a reconstruction of Gothic cavalry equipment based on archaeological finds. The armour, the long lance, the specialised cavalry saddle. These were the weapons that destroyed the Roman army at Adrianople. They look primitive compared to Roman military equipment, cruder and less sophisticated. But they were effective. They represented the future. Military historians debate whether Rome could have won at Adrianople with better leadership or different tactics. Could Valens have prevailed if he'd waited for Gratian? If he'd attacked immediately rather than negotiating? If Roman cavalry hadn't fled so quickly? Perhaps. But these questions miss the larger point. Adrianople wasn't an aberration. It was a revelation. The Goths didn't win through luck or Roman mistakes. They won because they possessed military capabilities that Rome couldn't match. Heavy cavalry that could deliver devastating shock charges was a war-winning technology. Rome didn't have it and couldn't quickly develop it. In the decades after Adrianople, Rome tried to adapt. The army was reformed along lines that emphasized cavalry and mobility. Germanic warriors and tactics were adopted wholesale. By the 5th century, Roman armies looked and fought nothing like the legions of the early empire. They were essentially barbarian armies commanded by Roman officers. But this adaptation came too late and was too incomplete. The military-industrial system that had once allowed Rome to field dozens of legions and replace catastrophic losses was breaking down. The economic and social foundations of Roman power were eroding. Adrianople accelerated this decline dramatically. On August 9th, 378 AD, the Roman Empire discovered that the world had changed and Rome hadn't changed with it. An emperor and his army marched confidently toward what they believed would be an easy victory over starving refugees. Instead, they encountered a military revolution that rendered Roman tactical doctrine obsolete. The heavy cavalry charge, delivered with perfect timing against an army that had no counter to it, destroyed in one afternoon what had taken centuries to build. The Goths didn't just win a battle at Adrianople. They demonstrated to the world that Rome was no longer the dominant military power. That heavy cavalry, not heavy infantry, was the future of warfare. That the Mediterranean world's long age of Roman dominance was ending. The thunder of Gothic hooves on that August afternoon was the sound of an empire falling and a new age beginning. Emperor Valens had gone seeking glory. He found instead a death so complete that his body was never recovered, and a defeat so total that it echoed through history. The Roman Empire would survive for another century in the west and 1,000 years in the east. But after Adrianople, it was surviving, not dominating. The lesson was written in 15,000 Roman corpses scattered across the Thracian plain. Speed and mobility had defeated discipline and tradition. The future belonged to the cavalry, and Rome had just discovered this truth too late to save itself. The Gothic cavalry that destroyed the Roman army at Adrianople represented the culmination of centuries of military evolution on the Eurasian steppes. While Roman military doctrine had ossified, frozen in traditions dating back to the Republic, the peoples beyond the frontier had been engaged in constant military innovation driven by survival necessity. The Goths themselves were relative newcomers to heavy cavalry warfare, having adopted and refined techniques learned from their eastern neighbours, particularly the Sarmatians and Alans, Iranian-speaking nomadic peoples who had perfected the art of armoured shock cavalry centuries before Adrianople. These steppe warriors had developed specialised breeding programs for war horses, creating animals larger and stronger than the typical Roman cavalry mount, capable of carrying an armoured rider and maintaining speed during charges. The Gothic adoption of heavy cavalry tactics accelerated after their migration into the Pontic steppes north of the Black Sea in the 3rd century AD. There, they encountered and absorbed military techniques from various nomadic groups. The Goths were unusual among Germanic peoples in their enthusiastic adoption of cavalry warfare. Most Germanic tribes remained primarily infantry-based. The Goths, influenced by their steppe environment and enemies, transformed themselves into a combined arms force where cavalry provided the decisive striking power. The weapons technology that made Gothic cavalry so effective was surprisingly simple, but devastatingly efficient. The contus, a lance measuring 12 to 14 feet in length, was held with both hands and couched under the arm during a charge. The combined momentum of horse and rider transformed this simple, wooden shaft tipped with iron into a weapon capable of piercing Roman shields and armour. Unlike Roman cavalry, who primarily used javelins and fought as mounted skirmishers, Gothic heavy cavalry was designed for close combat at high speed. The long lance gave them reach advantage over infantry, allowing them to strike before infantrymen could close to sword range. After the initial lance charge broke enemy formations, Gothic cavalry would draw their spear, longswords measuring 30 to 40 inches, and engage in close quarters melee. The saddle technology was critical to Gothic cavalry effectiveness. While stirrups wouldn't appear in Europe for another 2 centuries, Gothic saddles featured high front and rear cantles that essentially locked the rider in position. This 4-horned saddle design, adopted from Eastern nomads, allowed a rider to brace himself during a lance charge and absorb the impact of collision without being unhorsed. Roman cavalry, using simpler saddle designs and fighting primarily as skirmishers, had never developed techniques for the kind of massed shock charges that Gothic cavalry executed at Adrianople. The armour worn by Gothic noble cavalry varied considerably based on individual wealth and status. The wealthiest warriors wore scale armour, or chain mail that covered the torso and sometimes the arms. Scale armour, made from hundreds of small metal plates laced together, provided excellent protection while remaining flexible. Chainmail, more expensive and labour-intensive to produce, offered similar protection with less weight. Many Gothic cavalry wore helmets, typically simple conical designs that deflected blows. Some warriors had leg protection, and a few elite nobles possessed armour for their horses, creating true cataphracts comparable to Persian or later Byzantine heavy cavalry. But the majority of Gothic cavalry at Adrianople likely wore leather armour reinforced with metal pieces, carried shields, and relied on mobility and shock impact rather than complete armour coverage. The social structure that produced Gothic cavalry was fundamentally different from Roman military organisation. Gothic society was aristocratic and warlike. Noble families maintained warrior retinues as marks of status and power. These warriors trained from childhood in horsemanship and combat. War was not just a profession but an essential component of noble identity. The relationship between Gothic lords and their warrior followers was personal, based on mutual obligation and shared glory. This created highly motivated cavalry forces with strong unit cohesion. By contrast, Roman cavalry by the 4th century was a troubled arm. The traditional Roman emphasis on infantry meant that cavalry service carried less prestige. Roman citizens increasingly avoided military service entirely, forcing the empire to rely on Germanic recruits for both infantry and cavalry. The very people Rome was fighting at Adrianople could have been, and in some cases probably were, cousins or former comrades of Germanic warriors serving in Roman cavalry units. This created loyalty problems that manifested in the rapid flight of Roman cavalry at Adrianople. The tactical doctrine that Gothic cavalry employed at Adrianople had been refined through generations of warfare. The basic tactic was simple, but required precise timing and coordination. Hold defensive positions with infantry, typically behind field fortifications like the wagon circle used at Adrianople. Draw the enemy into attacking these fixed defences. When the enemy was committed and disordered from the assault, launch heavy cavalry from the flanks in overwhelming strength. The shock of the cavalry charge, delivered against enemies already engaged frontally, would shatter cohesion and create panic. Once enemy formations broke, pursue relentlessly with cavalry, preventing reorganisation and maximising casualties. This was fundamentally different from Roman tactical doctrine, which assumed infantry would be decisive and cavalry would play supporting roles. Roman generals at Adrianople deployed their forces according to centuries of tactical tradition that no longer matched battlefield realities. The failure of Roman cavalry at Adrianople wasn't just cowardice or incompetence. Roman cavalry doctrine emphasized avoiding decisive engagement with superior enemy cavalry. Roman horsemen were trained to skirmish, to harass, to scout, but not to engage in mass charges against heavy cavalry. When confronted with thousands of Gothic heavy cavalry bearing down on them at full gallop, Roman cavalry did exactly what their doctrine suggested. They withdrew to avoid destruction. The problem was that this withdrawal exposed the infantry to cavalry attack from the flanks, something Roman tactical theory had never adequately addressed, because Roman armies rarely faced enemies with cavalry strong enough to deliver such attacks. The Battle of Adrianople exposed structural problems in late Roman military organisation that extended far beyond a single day's fighting. The Roman army of 378 AD was dramatically different from the legions of earlier centuries. The classical manipular legion of the Republic and early Empire, with its flexible subunit organisation and emphasis on individual initiative, had given way to a more rigid command structure. Late Roman infantry fought in dense formations with less tactical flexibility. The quality of training had declined as the Empire struggled to maintain recruitment levels. Equipment quality had degraded as economic pressures forced cost-cutting in military production. The professional volunteer army that had conquered the Mediterranean was being replaced by a conscript force of increasingly questionable motivation and capability. The economic foundations of Roman military power were eroding by the late 4th century. The taxation system that funded the army was breaking down as productive agricultural land was abandoned or devastated by warfare. Inflation was rampant despite efforts at currency reform. The cost of maintaining frontier defences against multiple threats simultaneously was overwhelming imperial finances. Military pay was often in arrears. Equipment quality suffered as armories prioritised quantity over quality. The logistical system that had once kept Roman armies supplied across vast distances was fragmenting. These structural weaknesses didn't cause the defeat at Adrianople, but they meant Rome couldn't easily recover from it. In earlier centuries, catastrophic defeats like Cannae in 216 BC had been overcome because Rome possessed the economic and demographic resources to raise new armies and the social cohesion to maintain fighting spirit despite losses. By 378 AD, both resources and cohesion were in short supply. The immediate aftermath of Adrianople saw Gothic forces rampaging through the Balkans virtually unopposed. Thrace, one of the empire's most important provinces, was systematically devastated. Cities were besieged, though the Goths lacked sophisticated siege equipment and most major cities held out. Rural areas were thoroughly plundered. Agricultural production collapsed as farmers fled or were killed. The economic damage to the Eastern Empire was catastrophic. Emperor Gratian, rushing eastward when news of the disaster reached him, was forced to abandon plans for a decisive campaign when he realized no adequate army existed to fight one. Instead, he appointed Theodosius, a capable general from Spain, as Emperor of the East in January 379 AD. Theodosius inherited an empire in crisis with virtually no military resources to address it. The solution Theodosius eventually adopted was revolutionary and would fundamentally alter the nature of the Roman Empire. Unable to defeat the Goths militarily, Theodosius negotiated. The settlement of 382 AD granted the Goths land in Thrace and Moesia with significant autonomy. They would retain their own leaders, laws, and military organisation. In exchange, they would provide military forces to serve under Roman command when required. This was unprecedented. Previous barbarian settlements had involved groups being broken up, disarmed, and dispersed to prevent them from maintaining military capability. The Gothic federates maintained themselves as a coherent military force within Roman territory. It was an acknowledgement of Roman military weakness. The empire couldn't expel the Goths, couldn't defeat them, and therefore had to accommodate them. The federate system created by the settlement of 382 AD became the template for future barbarian settlements. Throughout the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire would grant similar arrangements to Vandals, Burgundians, Visigoths, and Franks. Each settlement further eroded imperial control and transferred military power to autonomous barbarian groups. The transformation of the Roman army accelerated after Adrianople. By 400 AD, the majority of Roman field armies consisted of barbarian federates or Germanic recruits. The composition of the army had changed from Romans using some barbarian auxiliaries to barbarians serving nominally under Roman command. Roman generals increasingly were of Germanic origin. The great Roman general Stilicho, who dominated Western imperial politics from 395 to 408 AD, was half Vandal. The theoretical commander of Roman armies was married to a Roman princess and served as regent for a Roman emperor, but his troops were largely Germanic, and his loyalties were complex. The cultural impact of Adrianople resonated through Roman society. The defeat shattered assumptions about Roman superiority that had underpinned imperial ideology for centuries. Roman writers struggled to explain how the eternal empire could suffer such catastrophic defeat. Some blamed moral decay, arguing that Romans had become soft and decadent. Others blamed Christianity, claiming abandonment of traditional gods had cost Rome divine protection. Still others blamed corrupt officials and incompetent leadership. What few Romans were willing to acknowledge was that the defeat represented a fundamental shift in military capabilities. The technological and tactical advantages that had made Roman legions dominant were gone. Other peoples had closed the capability gap and in some areas, like heavy cavalry, surpassed Roman forces. The psychological impact on Roman soldiers was significant. Troops who had been taught that Roman discipline and tactics were inherently superior now knew that barbarian cavalry could destroy Roman formations. This knowledge degraded morale and fighting spirit. Soldiers were less willing to stand firm against cavalry charges when they had heard what happened at Adrianople. Officers were less confident in ordering attacks when they knew their formations might be vulnerable to flank charges by heavy cavalry. The Battle of Adrianople influenced military thinking far beyond the immediate participants. Germanic tribes throughout Europe learned that Roman armies could be decisively defeated in pitched battle. This encouraged more aggressive postures toward the empire. The Vandals, Suevi and Alans, who crossed into Gaul in 406 AD, did so partly because they believed Roman military power was hollow. The Goths, who followed Alaric to sack Rome in 410 AD, included veterans of Adrianople who knew from personal experience that Roman armies could be beaten. The tactical lessons of Adrianople influenced warfare for centuries. The dominance of heavy cavalry that the battle demonstrated became the foundation of medieval military systems. The feudal knight, the armoured horseman who dominated European warfare from the 9th through 14th centuries, was a direct descendant tactically and technologically of the Gothic cavalry at Adrianople. The stirrup, which arrived in Europe during the 8th century, made cavalry even more effective by allowing riders to use lance and sword more efficiently while maintaining secure position on horseback. The combination of stirrup, saddle, heavy armour and lance created the ultimate expression of shock cavalry warfare. But the basic concept that heavy cavalry could deliver decisive charges that shattered infantry formations was proven at Adrianople. The infantry-dominated warfare of the classical Mediterranean world gave way to cavalry-dominated medieval warfare largely because Adrianople and subsequent battles demonstrated infantry vulnerability to properly employed heavy cavalry. Not until the development of effective pike formations and longbow tactics in the 14th and 15th centuries would infantry regain parity with cavalry. Even then, cavalry remained prestigious and important throughout the gunpowder era. The Eastern Roman Empire, which survived as the Byzantine Empire until 1453, learned the lessons of Adrianople more thoroughly than the Western Empire. Byzantine military doctrine emphasized cavalry, particularly the cataphracт heavy cavalry that became the empire's signature military force. Byzantine generals studied Adrianople as an example of what happened when cavalry was neglected. The Byzantines developed sophisticated combined arms tactics that integrated heavy and light cavalry with infantry and archery in flexible formations. This military innovation allowed the Eastern Empire to survive and at times thrive for 1,000 years after the Western Empire collapsed. The Western Empire's failure to adequately adapt to the post-Adrianople military reality contributed to its eventual collapse. Western emperors continued to rely on barbarian federates, whose loyalty was questionable and whose goals didn't align with imperial interests. The federate system that seemed necessary after Adrianople proved to be a slow poison. By 476 AD, when the last Western Roman emperor was deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer, the event was almost anticlimactic. Real power had already shifted to barbarian military leaders decades earlier. The Gothic cavalry that won at Adrianople were distant ancestors of warriors who would establish Gothic kingdoms in Spain and Italy. The Battle of Adrianople stands as one of history's decisive battles, not because it immediately destroyed the Roman Empire, but because it revealed that Rome's military dominance had ended. The tactics, training, and organization that had conquered the Mediterranean world were obsolete. The economic and social systems that supported Roman military power were failing. The psychological confidence that had sustained Roman soldiers through defeats and setbacks was shattered. Emperor Valens rode to Adrianople, believing he would win an easy victory over desperate refugees. Instead, he precipitated a catastrophe that accelerated imperial decline. The heavy cavalry charge that destroyed his army on that August afternoon demonstrated conclusively that the age of infantry dominance was over. The Gothic warriors who delivered that charge were harbingers of a new military era where mounted warriors would dominate battlefields for the next 1,000 years. The lesson was written in Roman blood across the Thracian plain. Military supremacy isn't permanent. Tactical doctrine must evolve with changing technology and enemy capabilities. The army that rests on past glories while enemies innovate will eventually face a moment like Adrianople, where all the old certainties prove false and the cost of failure is annihilation. For Rome, that moment came on August 9th, 378 AD. The empire survived, but it was never the same. The confident imperial power that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries was replaced by a defensive, reactive state struggling to survive against enemies it could no longer reliably defeat. The Battle of Adrianople didn't just kill an emperor and his army. It killed the myth of Roman invincibility, and with it the psychological foundation of Roman power. The Goths rode away from Adrianople as victors who had destroyed the best army Rome could field. Within a generation, their descendants would be ruling Roman provinces as independent kings. The thunder of their cavalry charge echoed through the centuries as one of history's most consequential military victories and one of Rome's most catastrophic defeats. The Gothic victory at Adrianople created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield consequences. Within the Gothic Confederation itself, the triumph fundamentally altered their relationship with Rome and their perception of their own capabilities. Before Adrianople, Gothic leaders like Fritigern had sought accommodation with the empire, hoping to find refuge and security within Roman borders. After Adrianople, the Goths understood they could dictate terms rather than beg for scraps. The psychological transformation within Gothic society was profound. Warriors who had crossed the Danube as starving refugees, who had watched their children sold for dog meat by corrupt Roman officials, had now destroyed the emperor himself and the finest army Rome could assemble. This wasn't just military victory, it was validation. The Gothic warrior aristocracy, which had always valued martial prowess above all else, now possessed tangible proof that their way of war was superior to Roman methods. Young Gothic warriors who participated in the battle would spend the rest of their lives recounting the charge that shattered the Roman legions. The tactical details of Adrianople were studied and refined by Gothic military leaders. The coordination between Fritigern's defensive infantry tactics and the perfectly timed cavalry charge under Elatheus and Saphrax became a template. Future Gothic commanders would seek to replicate this combination, using infantry as an anvil against which cavalry could hammer enemy forces. The battle demonstrated that Gothic forces could execute complex combined arms operations requiring precise timing and coordination across separated forces. This wasn't barbarian mob warfare. It was sophisticated military operations conducted by a professional warrior class. The economic consequences of Adrianople for the Eastern Roman Empire were staggering and long-lasting. Thrace had been one of the empire's most productive provinces, a breadbasket that fed Constantinople and provided tax revenue critical to imperial finances. The devastation that followed Adrianople turned this wealthy region into a wasteland. Agricultural production collapsed as farms were burned and farmers killed or fled. The tax base that supported the eastern field armies evaporated. Cities that had been commercial centres were besieged, their trade disrupted even when their walls held. The replacement cost of the army lost at Adrianople was astronomical. Each soldier required equipment that took skilled craftsmen months to produce. Armour, weapons, shields, helmets, all had to be manufactured in imperial armories that were already struggling to meet demand. The cost of recruiting and training replacements, assuming recruits could even be found, would strain imperial finances for years. But beyond the immediate replacement costs, Rome had lost something irreplaceable: experienced officers and NCOs who understood tactics, logistics, and leadership. The institutional knowledge that died at Adrianople couldn't be quickly recreated. The imperial response to Adrianople revealed the depth of Roman decline. In earlier centuries, catastrophic defeats had been met with determination to raise new armies and continue fighting until victory was achieved. After Adrianople, the response was accommodation and compromise. Theodosius, brilliant administrator though he was, understood that the empire lacked the resources for a war of annihilation against the Goths. The settlement of 382 AD that ended the Gothic War was pragmatic, but it established dangerous precedents. The Goths were allowed to settle as a coherent group under their own leaders. They would provide military service but would not be integrated into Roman command structures as previous barbarian recruits had been. They would fight as Gothic units under Gothic commanders, only nominally under Roman overall command. This created an army within the empire that owed primary loyalty to Gothic leaders, not to Rome. The implications became clear within a generation when Alaric, who rose to leadership of the Gothic federates, used his military force to extort concessions from Rome and eventually to sack the city itself. Other barbarian groups observed the Gothic settlement with great interest. If the Goths could extract such favourable terms through military pressure, why not others? The Vandals, who crossed into Gaul in 406 AD and eventually established a kingdom in North Africa, were following the Gothic template: fight Rome when necessary, negotiate when possible, but always from a position of military strength. The Federate system metastasized throughout the 5th century, until the Western Empire consisted of a patchwork of semi-autonomous barbarian kingdoms that paid lip service to imperial authority while exercising real power independently. The religious dimension of Adrianople added another layer of complexity to its historical impact. The Gothic tribes had been converted to Christianity by Arian missionaries in the decades before Adrianople. Arianism, a form of Christianity that denied the full divinity of Christ, had been declared heretical by the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The Roman Empire officially supported Nicene Christianity, so the victors at Adrianople were Christian, but heretical Christians in Roman eyes. This created awkward theological and political situations in subsequent decades, as Arian Gothic federates served Roman emperors who were champions of Nicene orthodoxy. Some Roman writers interpreted Adrianople as divine punishment for Emperor Valens' support of Arianism. Valens had favoured Arian Christianity and persecuted Nicene Christians, particularly in the eastern provinces. When he died in humiliating defeat at the hands of Arian Goths, Orthodox Christian writers saw the hand of God delivering judgment. This interpretation was convenient for explaining Roman defeat without acknowledging military inferiority, but it complicated relations with the Gothic federates who were, from a Roman theological perspective, heretics. The personal stories from Adrianople that survived in historical sources illuminate the human dimension of the catastrophe. Ammianus Marcellinus preserved accounts of individual heroism and tragedy that give texture to the dry casualty statistics. He describes Tribune Sebastian, an officer who had previously defeated Gothic forces in smaller engagements, fighting with desperate courage as the Roman formation collapsed around him. Sebastian and his men formed a defensive square and fought until they were overwhelmed. Not one man in his unit survived. He records the fate of Trajan, a senior general commanding Roman infantry, who was wounded in the initial Gothic cavalry charge. Trajan attempted to rally his troops but was struck by multiple arrows. He fell and was trampled by the routing soldiers he had tried to lead. His body was never recovered from the battlefield. The story of Valens himself dying ignominiously either in the crush of battle or burned alive in a farmhouse, unrecognized and unmourned, stands as a powerful symbol of imperial decline. This was a Roman emperor, supposedly the most powerful man in the world, dead on a battlefield far from home with his body never properly honoured or even identified. The contrast with earlier imperial military disasters was stark. When Emperor Decius died fighting the Goths in 251 AD at the Battle of Abritus, it was considered shocking, a terrible omen. When Valens died at Adrianople 127 years later, it was still shocking but somehow less surprising. The empire had clearly entered a period where such disasters were possible, even likely. The archaeological evidence from the Adrianople region, while limited, provides some physical confirmation of the ancient written sources. Excavations have uncovered mass graves containing remains of soldiers from the late 4th century. The skeletal trauma visible on these remains tells stories of extreme violence. Skulls crushed by heavy impacts consistent with cavalry weapon strikes, bones showing cut marks from swords and lances. The physical evidence matches the written descriptions of catastrophic close-quarters combat. Equipment fragments recovered from the battlefield area include Roman military fittings, belt buckles, and armour fragments that can be dated to the late 4th century. Significantly, the artefacts show signs of being stripped from bodies rather than lost in normal military operations. This supports ancient accounts describing Gothic warriors systematically looting the Roman dead after the battle. The absence of complete weapons or armour sets in the archaeological record suggests thorough and systematic plundering of valuable military equipment. The geographic legacy of Adrianople persists in the modern landscape. The city, now Edirne in Turkey, still stands on the same strategic location that made it important in Roman times. The plains where the battle occurred are still visible, though modern agriculture has altered the details of the terrain. The area where the Gothic wagon circle likely stood is now farmland, but the gentle elevation that gave the Goths defensive advantage can still be identified. The tactical geography that shaped the battle remains readable in the landscape for those who know where to look. The historiographical debate about Adrianople has continued for over 1600 years. Byzantine historians, writing centuries after the event, interpreted Adrianople as a turning point marking the beginning of imperial decline. Medieval chroniclers saw it as divine judgment, or as a cautionary tale about the dangers of barbarian settlement within civilized lands. Renaissance and Enlightenment, historians debated whether the battle was a cause or symptom of Roman decline. Modern historians have placed Adrianople within broader contexts of late antique transformation, seeing it not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a dramatic moment in longer-term processes of political, military and social change. Edward Gibbon, in his monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published in the late 18th century, devoted extensive attention to Adrianople, seeing it as emblematic of Roman military decay. Gibbon blamed the defeat on declining Roman virtue and martial spirit, a moralizing interpretation typical of his era, but one that ignored the tactical and technological factors that actually determined the battle's outcome. Later historians, with access to better sources and less ideological investment in Roman superiority, recognized that Adrianople represented military evolution rather than moral decline. The German historian Hans Delbruck, writing in the early 20th century, analysed Adrianople from a professional military perspective and identified the decisive importance of Gothic cavalry. Delbruck understood that this was fundamentally a battle about military technology and tactics, not about virtue or divine favour. His analysis emphasised that Roman infantry tactics designed for Mediterranean warfare were poorly suited to combat against steppe-influenced cavalry forces. Contemporary military historians view Adrianople as a case study in the importance of combined arms warfare and tactical flexibility. The battle demonstrates what happens when military doctrine fails to adapt to changing threats. Roman forces at Adrianople were essentially fighting, according to principles that had worked against Mediterranean enemies, infantry armies that fought in similar fashion to Roman forces, against an enemy that combined defensive infantry with offensive heavy cavalry in coordinated operations. Roman tactical doctrine had no adequate response. The parallels to other historical military disasters are instructive. The French knights destroyed by English longbowmen at Crécy in 1346 were similarly victims of tactical doctrine that hadn't adapted to new weapons technology. The Polish cavalry charging German tanks in 1939, though largely mythological, captured the same essential dynamic of obsolete military methods meeting modern warfare. In each case, confidence based on past success blinded commanders to change circumstances until reality delivered brutal lessons on the battlefield. The counterfactuals around Adrianople are endlessly debatable but historically revealing. What if Valens had waited for Gratian and the Western reinforcements? With combined forces, Rome would have had overwhelming numerical superiority, and the Gothic cavalry charge might have been contained or defeated. What if Roman cavalry had stood and fought rather than fleeing immediately? The battle might have lasted longer, allowing Roman infantry more time to adapt to the flanking attacks. What if the Gothic cavalry hadn't arrived when it did? Fritigern's infantry might have been defeated before Elatheus and Saphrax could intervene, resulting in Gothic defeat and possibly the destruction of the Gothic Confederation. These counterfactuals highlight how contingent the outcome was on specific tactical decisions and timing, but they also reveal structural factors that would have persisted regardless of the battle's outcome. Roman military doctrine was inadequate for fighting steppe-style cavalry forces, whether that inadequacy was exposed at Adrianople or in some other battle. The economic, and demographic pressures weakening Roman military capabilities would have continued regardless. The Gothic refugee crisis would have required resolution, whether through military defeat or negotiated settlement. Adrianople crystallized problems that already existed rather than creating them from nothing. The cultural memory of Adrianople persisted in both Roman and Gothic traditions long after the battle. Byzantine military manuals written centuries later still referenced Adrianople as an example of what happened when cavalry was neglected or when armies engaged in hasty attacks without adequate reconnaissance. Gothic oral traditions, later written down, preserved heroic accounts of the battle that emphasized Gothic warrior prowess and tactical genius. These traditions served different purposes for each culture: cautionary tale for Romans, foundation myth for Goths, but both acknowledge the battle's decisive importance. The linguistic legacy of Adrianople appears in the evolution of military terminology. The Latin term federati, which originally meant treaty allies, evolved after 382 AD to specifically mean barbarian military units serving under treaty arrangements within Roman territory. This linguistic shift reflected the post-Adrianople reality, where Roman military power increasingly depended on barbarian federates. Similarly, Greek military terminology and Byzantine sources began distinguishing between Roman and barbarian cavalry tactics, acknowledging that different forces fought in fundamentally different ways. The demographic consequences of Adrianople extended beyond the immediate casualties. The destruction of so many experienced Roman soldiers meant the loss of thousands of men in their prime productive years. These weren't just soldiers, they were taxpayers, fathers, craftsmen, farmers, contributors to the empire's economic and social fabric. Their deaths created ripples through Eastern Roman society. Widows and orphans required support. Military recruitment became more difficult as the risks of military service became starkly apparent. The prestige of military service declined, making it harder to attract quality recruits. The settlement patterns in the Balkans were permanently altered by Adrianople and its aftermath. Thrace, which had been a thoroughly Romanized province with cities, villas, and intensive agriculture, was fundamentally transformed. Large areas were depopulated as Roman inhabitants fled and were replaced by Gothic settlers. Archaeological evidence shows the abandonment of Roman villa estates and their replacement with simpler settlement patterns characteristic of Gothic culture. This wasn't just political change, it was demographic and cultural replacement that would shape the region's character for centuries. The military innovations that emerged from Adrianople influenced warfare far beyond Roman borders. Germanic tribes throughout Europe learned that cavalry could be decisive against infantry if properly employed. The Visigoths who invaded Spain, the Ostrogoths who conquered Italy, the Vandals who crossed to North Africa, all employed cavalry forces as their primary striking arm, having learned from Gothic success at Adrianople. Even peoples who hadn't directly participated in the battle absorbed the tactical lessons through military intelligence and observation. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's great rival in the east, studied reports of Adrianople with great interest. Persian heavy cavalry, the cataphracts that had troubled Roman armies for centuries, received validation. The battle confirmed that properly employed cavalry could destroy even the legendary Roman legions. This influenced Persian tactical doctrine in subsequent wars against Rome, leading to greater emphasis on cavalry concentration and shock tactics. The administrative reforms that Theodosius implemented after Adrianople attempted to address the military weaknesses the battle had revealed. He reorganized the Eastern field armies, creating more flexible command structures and emphasizing cavalry forces. He established new recruitment policies designed to increase the number of Roman citizens serving rather than relying entirely on barbarian recruits. He invested in improving cavalry training and equipment, attempting to create Roman heavy cavalry units that could match Gothic capabilities. These reforms had limited success because they addressed symptoms rather than underlying causes. The economic and demographic fundamentals that made Roman military power unsustainable weren't fixable through administrative changes. The social transformation that made Roman citizens unwilling to serve in the army couldn't be reversed by imperial decree. The technological gap in cavalry warfare couldn't be closed quickly because it reflected generations of different military cultures and priorities. Rome could adopt Gothic tactics but couldn't instantly create the warrior culture that made those tactics effective. The personal reign of Theodosius, from 379 to 395 AD, was shaped entirely by the shadow of Adrianople. Every military decision, every diplomatic initiative, every internal reform was influenced by the knowledge that Rome had suffered catastrophic defeat and lacked the resources for another such disaster. Theodosius' military campaigns against various threats were cautious and methodical, designed to avoid the kind of decisive engagement that had destroyed Valens. When Theodosius did fight major battles, he did so with overwhelming force, often including large contingents of Gothic federates whose cavalry provided the decisive striking power Rome's own forces lacked. The irony that Rome now depended on Gothic warriors to protect it from other Gothic warriors wasn't lost on contemporary observers. The historian Zosimus, writing in the early 6th century, explicitly connected Adrianople to the empire's later troubles, arguing that the settlement of Gothic federates created an internal threat that eventually consumed the Western Empire. His analysis was overly simplistic but contained a kernel of truth. The federate system created by necessity after Adrianople did contribute to imperial fragmentation by placing military power in the hands of leaders whose primary loyalty was to their own people rather than to Rome. The religious and philosophical interpretations of Adrianople in late Roman culture revealed deep anxieties about imperial destiny. Christian writers debated whether the defeat represented divine judgment on imperial sins or a test of faith that Christians must endure. Pagan writers, increasingly marginalized in the Christianizing empire, suggested that abandoning the traditional gods had cost Rome their protection. These debates were really about Roman identity and purpose. If Rome could suffer such humiliating defeat, what did that mean about Roman superiority and the empire's destiny to rule the world? The archaeological evidence from Gothic settlements in the decades after Adrianople shows increasing wealth and sophistication. Grave goods from Gothic burials in the Balkans from the late 4th and early 5th centuries include high-quality weapons, jewellery, and imported Roman luxury goods. This material evidence confirms that the Gothic Confederation prospered after Adrianople, extracting resources from the empire while maintaining military independence. The contrast with deteriorating material culture in some Roman provincial sites suggests a transfer of wealth and power from Roman to Gothic hands. The numismatic evidence, coins minted and circulated in the post-Adrianople period, tells complementary stories. Roman coin hoards buried around the time of Adrianople and never recovered suggest panicked flight by property owners who didn't survive to reclaim their wealth. The debasement of Roman coinage in subsequent decades indicates financial stress, as the empire struggled to fund military recovery. Gothic imitation of Roman coins suggests both admiration for Roman culture and desire to participate in Roman economic systems, but on Gothic terms. The linguistic influence of Gothic on late Latin and early Romance languages preserved memories of Gothic military dominance. Words related to warfare and military equipment borrowed from Gothic into Latin reflect the reality that Goths were teaching Romans about cavalry warfare rather than the reverse. This linguistic evidence, subtle but persistent, confirms that the cultural exchange after Adrianople flowed from Goths to Romans in military matters, reversing centuries of Roman cultural dominance over barbarian peoples. The climatic and environmental context of Adrianople adds another dimension to understanding the battle and its consequences. The late 4th century was a period of climatic stress across Europe and the Mediterranean. Colder temperatures, irregular rainfall, and agricultural disruption contributed to migrations and resource pressures. The Hun expansion that drove the Goths to the Danube was itself partly driven by environmental pressures in Central Asia. Roman agricultural productivity was declining, reducing the tax base and military recruitment pool. These environmental factors didn't cause Adrianople, but they created the context of scarcity and pressure that made the consequences more severe. The battle occurred at a moment when the empire was already stressed and lacked resilience to absorb major shocks. The naval dimension of Roman power, often overlooked in discussions of Adrianople, was unaffected by the land battle, but couldn't compensate for land power deficiencies. Rome still controlled the Mediterranean Sea and could move forces and supplies by water more efficiently than any rival. But naval dominance couldn't protect land frontiers or defeat cavalry armies operating in the interior. The strategic limitation of sea power in a continental conflict became increasingly apparent in the decades after Adrianople. Rome could control coastlines but struggled to project power inland against mobile cavalry forces. This strategic weakness would contribute to the loss of North Africa to the Vandals in the 5th century, as coastal cities couldn't be defended when their agricultural hinterlands were controlled by hostile forces. The lessons of Adrianople remained relevant long after the immediate participants had vanished into history. Medieval commanders studying Roman military history learned that tactical innovation trumps traditional methods, that cavalry properly employed could dominate infantry, and that overconfidence based on past success was dangerous. These lessons influenced military thinking throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. Military academies in the 18th and 19th centuries used Adrianople as a case study in the importance of combined arms, the danger of underestimating enemies, and the consequences of tactical inflexibility. The battle's influence extended even into 20th century military analysis. German staff officers before World War I studied Adrianople as an example of the decisive Battle of Annihilation, The complete destruction of enemy forces that Prussian military theory sought to achieve, that they drew exactly wrong lessons, focusing on annihilation while missing the defensive advantages and importance of combined arms, demonstrates both the battle's enduring fascination and the danger of selective historical interpretation. Modern military analysis of Adrianople emphasizes the importance of intelligence failure, the danger of assuming enemy weakness without verification, and the critical nature of combined arms coordination. These lessons remain relevant in contemporary military operations where technological superiority can be negated by tactical innovation, and where assumptions about enemy capabilities prove catastrophically wrong. The ultimate significance of Adrianople lies not in any single factor, but in the convergence of multiple elements: tactical evolution that rendered Roman methods obsolete, strategic overconfidence that led to preventable errors, economic and demographic weaknesses that prevented recovery from defeat, political consequences that forced accommodation with enemies Rome couldn't defeat, cultural and psychological impacts that undermined Roman self-confidence and prestige. The battle was simultaneously a military defeat, an economic disaster, a political crisis, and a psychological trauma. These elements reinforced each other, creating cascading consequences that no single reform or victory could reverse. On August 9th, 378 AD, Gothic cavalry charged across a Thracian plain, and in doing so charged into history as executors of one of antiquity's most consequential battles. They didn't know they were ending an era, they were simply fighting for survival, for revenge against Roman mistreatment, for glory and plunder. But their success at Adrianople demonstrated conclusively that Roman military dominance had ended, that new forms of warfare had emerged that Rome couldn't counter, and that the Mediterranean world's future belonged to peoples Rome had considered barbarians. The thunder of hooves that afternoon echoed across centuries as the sound of empires falling and new ages beginning.